Hi, I'm Kelly Lynch, and this is U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. In Montreal, Canada, there's an unusual modernist structure on an island. Designed by Buckminster Fuller as the U.S. pavilion for the 1967 World's Fair, or what everyone else on the planet called the World Expo, the Biosphere attracted more than 5 million visitors, and today the site is a museum dedicated to the environment. And it's a movie star, too, appearing in the original Battlestar Galactica episode Greetings from Earth, in Robert Altman's movie Quintet, and in many Canadian TV shows. Just Google Biosphere. That's Biosphere. In case you are a dome geek, and we know there are some out there, the Biosphere is a Class 1 icosahedral dome, as opposed to a Class 2 dodecahedral or a Class 3 tetrahedral. Just saying. It's a 32-frequency version where the inner and outer layers are connected by latticework, standing 200 feet high and covered by 1,900 acrylic panels. Hey, Lego, out in Denmark, this sounds like the perfect subject for your next architectural kit. Joining us today from Montreal is Michele Picard of Montreal's Bureau of Public Art, plus from New York, an expert on World's Fair history, Beverly Payeff Masey. And now, still crazy about Legos after all these years, here's Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Legos are indeed one of the most enduring and certainly the most successful toy of all time. I mean, we all love Mr. Potato Head, especially when Don Rickles does the voice, but Legos are king. First put on sale in 1947, over 400 million people around the world have played with them, and 7 sets are sold every second.
Wow.
What started as fairly plain bricks have exploded to thousands of specialty parts, including a whole universe of Star Wars ships and planets and models. In 2000, the British Association of Toy Retailers named Legos the Toy of the Century, beating the teddy bear and Barbie. And just a few years ago, the Denmark-based firm opened its amazing new modernist headquarters, designed by Bjarke Ingels. And it looks just like bricks.
Huh.
Before that, Top Gear presenter James May built a real house, full scale, out of Legos in 2009. But sadly, it had to be torn down, as James May did not have a building permit or planning permission.
Oops.
Which gets me to a shameless promotion for which we are tragically not getting paid, the Lego architectural sets. These have been around for about 15 years, and they started small, just small boxes, 100 parts. Now they are kits with several thousand pieces. For the modernist you love, there's no better gift than a Lego architecture set. You can build Fallingwater, or the Farnsworth House, or the Burj Al Arab, or dozens of modernist buildings around the world. Like the McRib, some of these kits go out of stock, then come back. And, like Starbucks chili mocha latte, which I still mourn for, some never come back. You have to get them on eBay. We searched for a Biosphere Lego set online, and there was none. So hey, Lego in Denmark, here's your next big hit. You're welcome. And yes, thank you, we'd love one. Our address is on the website. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In our continuing space saga, welcome to Episode 2. There is unrest in the Galactic Senate, making it difficult for the few remaining modernist knights to maintain design harmony. Several thousand planets have declared it illegal to build modernist, insisting on symmetrical structures, on clear-cut lots with Palladian windows, missile silo entries, and vast arrays of gables and dormers. Senator Angela Roll, former slave girl rescued by Queen Hadid back in Episode 1, has a critical vote to create an army of weaponized architecture school deans. But the evil emperor has other plans, and rumor has it the rebel postmodernists, yes, they're still around, are building a new battlecruiser that doubles as a ski slope when it lands. Copycats. Centuries earlier, in 2022, you can count on Senator Angela's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, a real estate agent with specialized design training, advising buyers and sellers of modernist houses on everything, from appropriate renovation to ripping out Palladian windows with your lightsaber. Angela Roll is your special real estate agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL, or call 919-995-0550.
Thanks, Tom. Here are some more facts about the Biosphere in Montreal. An incredibly long escalator, about 120 feet long, was the longest ever built at the time in 1967. During structural renovations in 1976, a fire burned the acrylic panels, leaving the underlying steel frame, and the site remained closed and virtually abandoned until 1990, when Environment Canada purchased the site to become the interactive museum it is today, and that museum opened in 1995.
Michele Picard has degrees in environmental design and urban studies from the University of Quebec and MIT. She worked at the Canadian Centre for Architecture and the National Institute for Urbanization Research. Since 2002, she has been with the City of Montreal as head of cultural facilities and public art, of which Biosphere is a part. Welcome, Michele.
Hi, how are you?
We are doing fine.
We're good. Thanks for coming.
Beverly Payeff Masey is a design historian and educator with extensive U.S. Foreign Service experience in Europe and Southeast Asia. She is the director of the Masey Archive, a resource for scholars, architectural historians, and filmmakers, co-founded with her late husband, Jack Masey. Jack was director of design for the United States Information Agency during the height of the World's Fairs and the Cold War, and is the person who commissioned Buckminster Fuller to create the Biosphere. Beverly is working on a book that explores World Expo architecture and public diplomacy, and she's also a colleague of past podcast guest Mina Chow, who's the producer of the documentary airing on PBS this spring, Face of a Nation, What Happened to the World's Fair. Welcome, Beverly.
Hello, good to be with you.
So, Beverly, let's start with the basics. In short, what is a World's Fair and why it is important? Please limit your answer to 2 minutes.
Okay. In short, a World's Fair or a World Expo is a very large international exhibition, large enough to be called a mega event, in which the nations of the world come together to put on display their accomplishments in culture, technology, and whatever else they think they would like to share with the world about their homelands. In short, that's what an expo is. There are currently 2 types of World's Fairs or expos that are recognized by the Bureau of International Expositions in Paris, otherwise known as the BIE, and these are Category 1 Universal Expos, which are giant events, and they are the equivalent of the Olympics of World's Fairs.
The big ones, yeah.
The big ones. And Expo 67 in Montreal was one of these very big events. The smaller expos that are recognized by the BIE are usually targeted at a particular theme. These smaller fairs last for 3 months, and they're able to be mounted in the space between the larger expos, and those occur once every 5 years.
In a way, sort of like the difference between the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics?
No, not really. One is very large and one is smaller. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
The most important difference, I think, for us is that the larger events have rules which don't apply to the smaller events with regard to architecture.
Okay.
So the larger events require that participating nations build their own pavilions to represent their nation, that these pavilions are architecturally adventurous, and that at the end of the fair, which is 6 months, they have to be destroyed. So not only are these examples of architecture that are adventurous, but they are also ephemeral.
And these are not tents. I mean, these are real buildings.
Yes. The building that's the Biosphere in Montreal is one of these buildings. And it is one of the few that survived the death knell that most of these structures experience at the end of a fair. So there are very few that are in this kind of specialized category. We can think of the Eiffel Tower in Paris from the 1889 fair. Seattle in
the Space Needle,
1962, the Space Needle, and we can think of the Biosphere, now Biosphere in Montreal.
And Canada Place in Vancouver, isn't that a holdover from the Expo?
Well, there are a number of buildings that are holdovers, but
yeah, okay.
I think the ones that sort of represent cities that are iconic are very, very few.
Yeah, my favorite is the Atomium in Brussels.
Yes.
That is just an incredibly wonderful structure that no one remembers anymore.
Absolutely.
Beverly, when was the first World's Fair, World Expo?
The first World's Fair, the event that is credited as being the first World's Fair, was held in London in 1851, and it was called the Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace, which brought together the larger nations of the world to show the products of their industry. Was very successful, and the building in which it was housed was one of the greatest innovations of World's Fairs, and it was created in 9 months, a huge building made of steel and glass, and in itself a kind of architectural innovation. Since then, we had a proliferation of World's Fairs, thousands of World's Fairs being run, eventually so many that the Bureau of International Expositions was created in Paris in 1928 to kind of bring a little order to this explosion of World's Fairs.
There were thousands?
Thousands, yes. In the United States, they were in small towns, they were in states, they were in countries, and some were not reputable. And so to organize this, the Bureau of International Expositions was created in 1928.
And they've been running it ever since.
Yes.
The Crystal Palace, is it still around?
No, it lasted a long time, but eventually, through wars and fires, it is no longer extant, unfortunately.
Okay, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Now, the World's Expos, the World's Fairs, are also very important for public diplomacy, and you were very involved in that.
Absolutely. My late husband, Jack Masey, was a director of design for the U.S. Information Agency, and it was his job to kind of see how architecture and design could communicate information to audiences around the world who often didn't speak English about the United States. This responsibility of Jack's was, let me try to make it as brief and simple to understand as I can with regard to how he would evaluate architecture and design that would be well suited to the job of public diplomacy. Jack felt that a work of architecture or design should be, first of all, quintessentially American, and that it should be notable for its technological and aesthetic inventiveness. And if it met those three criteria, he was willing to kind of consider it as representative of the United States with regard to a kind of public diplomacy.
And so his job was to organize the U.S. participation in that and get the pavilion built.
Yes, and to make decisions about who was going to participate in that. Let's just start with the history of the building in Montreal. Few people know that the progenitor of the dome in Montreal was created with Jack and Bucky collaborating at a U.S. pavilion in, of all places, Kabul, Afghanistan.
Really?
Yes. That was in 1956. And the U.S. government decided to enter into an event called the Jeshin International Fair in Kabul, but they didn't make this decision until about 12 weeks before the opening of the fair. Jack was at that time a young exhibits officer based in New Delhi, India. And they called him and said, Jack, we want to put up this pavilion, U.S. pavilion in Kabul in 12 weeks, but we don't have a pavilion, so we think we're going to put up a circus tent. Do you think that would be a good idea? And he said, no, I think that'd be a terrible idea. And they said, well, have you got a better one? And he said, well, yes, I do. And so at that point, he went back to the States, contacted Bucky Fuller, and the two met in the lobby of the Roosevelt Hotel in New York and worked out a plan where Fuller would be able to deliver a geodesic dome to Kabul, Afghanistan, to function as the U.S. pavilion there in 12 weeks. And that was the beginning of Jack's absolute commitment to Bucky Fuller domes as a way to represent the United States, effectively because it met all the boxes on his short list. It was quintessentially American, and it was spectacular in terms of its inventiveness and technological advancement. So he was dedicated to getting a big Bucky Fuller dome somewhere.
And I guess it could also be constructed fairly quickly?
Yes, the one in Kabul, Afghanistan could, yes. It was flown in, and it was assembled by Afghan workers who were illiterate, but the parts of the dome were color-coded, so they could be assembled by color.
A giant erector set, really.
Yeah, it was, and it went up in 48 hours. And it was such a spectacular success that smaller dome was immediately taken on by the Commerce Department, who contracted for Fuller domes, geodesic domes, to be used at trade fairs around the world for a number of years. But those were not the big domes that Jack was looking for. He felt a really big dome would be a spectacular representation of the United States. So the next chance he had to get Fuller to design a really big dome was in Moscow in 1959, where the U.S. was participating in an exchange of national exhibitions with the Soviet Union. There was an 8-acre site there for the U.S. exhibit, and Jack asked Fuller to design a dome for that exhibit. But the paperwork couldn't be worked out with the Soviets until 7 months before the exhibit opened. And the Soviets were insisting that Fuller provide a dome that could withstand the snow loads of Moscow, which Fuller did not have. And so Fuller recommended, interestingly, the work of his student, Donald Richter, who had designed a hard-shell dome and patented that dome, and that dome was manufactured by Kaiser Aluminum. That was the dome that actually appeared in Moscow at the American National Exhibition of '59, site of the Khrushchev-Nixon kitchen debate. Bucky traveled to Moscow at the invitation of the Soviets, had himself photographed in front of the dome, and most people just assumed with that photograph that he designed the dome.
And did it withstand the snow?
Oh, yes, it did. Yes.
Very strong. They're made out of the right
things.
things.
It was an aluminum, yes. It was a hard-shell aluminum dome.
Michele, tell us about the Biosphere today in terms of the island that it's on. I hope people are Googling now Biosphere so they can get a sense of what it looks like. But besides the dome, there are also different buildings. What is in part of the campus as it exists today?
On the St. Helens Island, there were two islands during the Expo, and mainly the Notre Dame Island and the St. Helens Island. St. Helens Island, where the Biosphere actually is, there is also remains of several other pavilions, the France Pavilion and the Quebec Pavilion and the Canadian Pavilions, and also some structures of other pavilions that are still existing. But this is a park, there's the Parc Jean Drapeau. The two islands are part of the park, and it's mainly the site for people that are going on the weekend, picnics and festivals, and also there's a site for the F1, Formula One settings.
Really? There's car racing through the islands?
Yes, on the Notre Dame Island. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
In the middle of a St. Lawrence River?
Yeah.
Yes, it's a fabulous site for the F1. It's a fabulous site, but of course it's only on the island. It's not going into the city. The site for the F1 is on the island.
Are the other pavilions in active use, or are they still vacant?
There are three pavilions that are in use. The France Pavilion and the Quebec Pavilion that are operated for the casino, the Quebec and Montreal casino.
Oh, I see.
Casinos.
What do you know?
Yes.
Do you win euros or something?
No. You loonies. Loonies, Tom.
Loonies and toonies. Yeah.
Loonies, yes. And there's also the Canadian Pavilion, which is hosting the administration of Parc Jean Drapeau and other structure that people can visit. And we also have the Calder that was given to the city of Montreal, which was designed for Expo 67, and it's still in our collection.
That's the giant sculpture, mobile?
No, it's not a mobile. It's a stabile.
A what? Say again?
A stabile, it's a fixed structure.
Oh, okay.
There's a like a diagonal elevator or a funicular, which you were just talking about on the previous show. Isn't there in Montreal?
Yes, it's in the Olympic Tower.
Yeah.
In the Olympic, yes.
Right,
it's
from the
quite
Olympic
far
Village.
Away.
Okay.
Yeah,
nowhere
different
near.
section of town, Tom.
Okay. I've only been there once, but I remember.
Stick to one mega event, please.
Sorry.
You have to come back.
I'll be happy to.
Beverly, it seems like Walt Disney took this whole idea and turned it into Epcot, right?
He did. He wanted to have a permanent World's Fair, and he knew that that would be a very effective way to keep people entertained. This is true, and he did create this beautiful hard-shell sphere. That's interesting. For me, it's particularly interesting when one compares the history of the dome in Montreal by Bucky Fuller, which most people think was submitted as a beautiful spherical dome, but it was not. At the time that Bucky was asked to submit a proposal for the U.S. Pavilion at Expo 67, he was very reluctant to actually submit a proposal for a geodesic dome. What he submitted instead was a space frame, a tensegrity space frame, under which was an early version of something that he called the World Game. And this proposal really surprised Jack, who was his great advocate within the U.S. government and had been in order to get this kind of magnificent Bucky Fuller dome built somewhere. The original submission by Fuller for the U.S. Pavilion at Expo 67 did not meet the program requirements in two ways. One more surprising than the other, I think. The U.S. was expecting in excess of 1 million visitors a month to the pavilion for the 6-month duration of the fair. And the space frame could only handle about 150,000 people a month. So it really didn't meet program requirements in that regard. The more surprising thing, however, is that Fuller, in explaining his desire to have the World Game as part of the U.S. Pavilion, as part of the conceptual thinking that he proffered to Jack was this, and this is a quote from Fuller, "The USA is not a nation. It is a crossbreeding world man at his most advanced state." So it was very difficult for Jack to propose this World Game as part of a U.S. pavilion when the designer was denying that the U.S. was a nation.
Yeah.
So both the World Game and the tensegrity space frame were rejected by Jack, who was still determined to get a large geodesic dome from Fuller at Expo 67. And Jack asked Fuller to resubmit a second proposal, which Fuller did, this time with a hemispherical dome, again with the World Game. And Jack, again, rejected the World Game and accepted the proposal for the hemispherical dome. But at this time, the teams that were working together to design the U.S. Pavilion were Bucky Fuller and his partner Shoji Sadao as architects of the building, and another team, a group of young architects called Cambridge 7 Associates, who were doing the interior structures and exhibits. When this combined team started working together, one of the young architects at Cambridge 7, Peter Chimaev, suggested that perhaps the dome would be more dramatic and have greater height that they could access in terms of the exhibits if it were shaped as a sphere. And he asked the Fuller team if they could do this. And they worked on it a bit and said yes, they could. And so that is how the shape of what became known as Bucky's biggest bubble eventually evolved.
Now, but did Jack and Bucky Fuller work with Disney at all on
No.
whether Spaceship Earth, I believe it's called?
No, Jack did not. No.
Okay.
No.
And did the the sphere accommodate more than 150,000 people a month?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Eventually, in the 6-month period that the fair was opened, more than 9 million people visited the U.S. Pavilion.
Right.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Michele, what kind of public art do visitors see when they visit the museum and park now?
Actually, the museum is an environmental museum, and we're using art to help people understand what is happening on the planet and about the climate changes, etc. It's not an art museum especially. There is art throughout the island on the site of the Parc Jean Drapeau.
Some of this, like the Calder sculpture, was been there a long time, and I understand that there's new art coming in all the time.
Yes, there will be. Actually, the Biosphere was a Canadian Museum for Environmental Sciences for 25 years. The City of Montreal is the owner of the pavilion since 1967. The American government gave that to the City of Montreal, and it was operated by the Canadian government as a museum. And now it's returned to Montreal, and it's the Environmental Museum. It is part of Space for Life, which is 4 other institutions: the Botanical Garden, Insectarium, the Planetarium, the Biosphere, and the Biodome. So the Biosphere is part of a complex of museum, which is off-site, and it's close to the Olympic Tower that you were talking about a little bit earlier. And the Biosphere is the only one that is on the island.
Okay. Now, Beverly, your husband Jack wrote a book, The Cold War Confrontations, about the politics behind these World Expos, which many people don't realize is there. What is that all about?
I think you can sum it up in one word, probably money. There's a lot of money to be made with these World's Fairs. And for myself, there's a kind of aspect of World's Fairs that I think I would like to stress, because on the whole, many people in the United States do not know that World's Fairs still exist. There is a major Category 1 World Expo that's ongoing right now in Dubai.
Oh, yes.
At the United Arab Emirates. It is the largest World's Fair ever mounted in the history of the world, and it's almost unknown here in the United States, which I think is too bad, particularly from the point of view of public diplomacy, because you asked me a bit ago about what is a World's Fair. One of my favorite definitions was written by James McCabe in his description of the first World's Fair ever mounted here in the United States, and that was the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. And what he said was, a World's Fair is a cordial international competition where the nations of the world come together to display their triumphs in the noble arts of peace. And I find that just charming language, but the sentiment is an important one. For the history of World's Fairs since 1851, the displays that have been put on are displays that relate to peacetime. There have been no displays of weapons, of the kind of accoutrement of the military-industrial complex that some visitors are hoping to see, but have never been there. These are events where nations of the world get together to cordially explore what each other has to offer, to meet each other, to develop friendships, to develop a better understanding. It's really an important thing to do. And so I think if there's any way that we can sort of interest the American press in World's Fairs, I think that would be a very positive thing for American public diplomacy.
The last two in America were in New Orleans and Knoxville, Tennessee, which were not very successful.
No, they were not.
And not particularly well attended. And then it looks like America withdrew about that time from the World Expo system.
Well, for the United States of America, there are two expo systems. Participation in international exhibitions for the United States was, during the Cold War at least, managed by the United States Information Agency, which was responsible for sort of telling America's story to audiences abroad, audiences outside the United States. Their work was seen as perhaps an opportunity to propagandize the American public, and therefore whatever they did was not, by law, permitted to be distributed in the United States. So information about fairs and designers that were part of USIA projects overseas were not well published in the United States. When the United States was participating in a fair at home, Seattle, for instance, that was not a national pavilion as USIA would mount, but a federal pavilion, and that was mounted by the State Department. And the State Department had a smaller crew of people interested in design. So sometimes those pavilions were, let me just say from the point of architecture, not particularly successful.
But ultimately, the U.S. hasn't participated in any level the last, 20, 30 years?
No. With the end of the Cold War in 1991, Congress felt that it no longer needed to represent the United States abroad. and therefore we shouldn't participate in fairs if we had to pay for them. And they insisted that the private sector pay for American representation abroad. This immediately raised certain problems because if you get corporations to pay for your pavilion, the corporations really want the pavilions to represent them, perhaps more than they want it to represent the people of the United States. And up until quite recently, this was the way the U.S. funded its pavilions abroad. But in the most recent pavilion in Dubai, the private sector just sort of said, look, this is not our responsibility. We don't really want to do this. We'd like the U.S. Congress to fund this. So we're sort of in an impasse right now with funding. And
but isn't the government of the UAE funding our pavilion?
Currently, yes, it is.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. The government of the UAE is currently spending $60 million to pay for the U.S. pavilion.
Oh,
yep.
That's...
Yep, a little embarrassing there.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. It is.
Now, Michele, what went into the transformation of the Biosphere into an environmental museum?
You mentioned earlier that there was the fire of 1976, and it was a lot damaged and unoccupied for the 80s mainly. And in 1990, the Canadian government, the Quebec government, and the city were pressured by some of the heritage activators to protect the pavilion because of its value. And so there was a competition to transform, to keep whatever remnants were still in good shape, which is the dome and the platforms and the structure. And because of the situation on the St. Lawrence River, it was transformed into some sort of environmental and water museum at that time. And it was mainly about the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes and the environmental issues around the pavilion because it was in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. There was no environmental museum in Canada. And so the choice was to keep the pavilion and to transform it as little as possible and to respect the heritage of the pavilion. And it was transformed and reopened in 1995.
And this was before all the discussion about global warming and climate change. So I assume that the museum has pulled in some of those themes as well in recent years?
Exactly. Yes. For the 1995 until the beginning of 2002 or 3, it was mainly about water. And then it changed into more environmental issues around the country. It was more national than local on the St. Lawrence River. There was some conferences and exhibition around the issue of environmental and climate changes, and it helped the discussion with the public and the scientific, of course.
We don't hear much about this in the U.S., of course, but climate change has really affected Canada and its environment because so much of it is cold and covered in ice much of the year, and that has been melting.
Yes. It has been melting, and we see the effect even in the south, in Montreal, and the weather is really changing. And actually, we're in December, and in Montreal, there's not been very much snow, a few centimeters, inches, and that's it. And there will be changes in the next years, and faster than any other country afterwards, we've heard.
Beverly, I wanted to ask you about the Masey Archive. What is that, and what is it all about?
The Masey Archive is a collection of documents, film, ephemera from the period when the U.S. was doing exhibitions abroad during the Cold War and beyond. And what we've done is to create an archive for those people who want to understand what happened in terms of the public diplomacy programs of the U.S. and how architecture and design intersected with it. Both Jack and I feel very strongly that architecture and design are superb tools for communication for people who may not speak your language. They're extraordinarily effective, but I might say the U.S. government has sort of lost sight of this, and we sort of maintain a kind of outpost for people who might be otherwise required to go to NARA or the Library of Congress to find out about events that took place, but without someone to put into context how the design components and the political components fit together.
Is there any chance that the U.S. government will re-embrace World Expos and participation?
We are hoping so. Certainly working with Mina Chow and her film, we're exerting the pressure that we can and hope that we will be effective. There is some suggestion that there has been perhaps a bit of progress in this regard, but I think that remains to be seen, whether that is going to happen in the near future. Let's be optimistic and say we hope that will happen eventually.
Well, if you think it's bad that the UAE is paying for our pavilion, it was worse when McDonald's and Nike and Pepsi were paying for it. So
we've had some inglorious moments, for sure. Though I must say, just hearing what is happening with the Biosphere now, I think Bucky Fuller would be very happy to hear this. His great moment of pride with the pavilion in Montreal was that he felt it was the lightest building that did the most with the least at the fair. And he didn't think any other building could match him in that regard. So he was very much in favor of this idea of preserving and not wasting with regard to materials. And I think he'd be thrilled.
Like a green building.
Yes, it was a green building.
Before we even knew what that was.
Right.
That's right. And he was advocating for that for a very long time, for sure.
Michele, how can people visit the Biosphere, and what's your website?
The website is Space for Life Biosphere. It's very easy to find. And there will be a new exhibition this spring, and that's funny what Beverly was mentioning, the citation that she gave Buckminster about the largest space to covered with best material is one of the citations that we're working to put into the new exhibition that will be held in the hall, which will be the introduction to the building. And we're very proud to find documents and information that are related to environment into Bucky's archives or even the Masey archive, and we're looking at it. So there will be a new exhibition in the hall, and there will be actually an immersive film about the relationship with nature. And there's also an exhibition on meteo and temperature, which is called This Is Not an Umbrella. An outside exhibition, selection of giant photographic from National Geographic. So there's a lot to do in the pavilion, but there's also a lot to do outside, which is a great public park, the Parc Jean Drapeau.
I think this is wonderful. I would like to ask, as part of the public diplomacy aspect of the pavilion, to have mentioned that the building, which is now the Biosphere, was donated by the United States to the city of Montreal as a symbol of our ongoing friendship.
Exactly.
And I think that would be a lovely thing to see.
And since the opening in 1995, there has been a relationship with the embassy and the consulate in Montreal, and they're participating, the consulate, into some exhibition in the entrance hall. Actually, there's an exhibition called Species Without Borders, and it's the species that we share across the border. And this exhibition will be replaced by the exhibition about the building and the green spaces and the green roof and the green walls that we have, and all the systems that we use in the Biosphere, actually.
Beverly, Michele, thank you so much for joining us. This has been fascinating. I hope people will Google the Biosphere and put it in their travel plans.
Hope so. It's a fascinating place to be. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Modernist Realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 12,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino researches guests while secretly building a Star Wars Millennium Falcon Lego set her daughters don't know she has. They definitely shouldn't look under the dresser in a box marked 2004 tax forms. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another icosahedral but not dodecahedral edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
Oh, give me a dome where the modernists roam.
And the architects are not sleepy all day.